In the last lecture, I walked you through the folder structure which was created by Create React App, and we edited our app.js file. Let's now dive deeper into what we see here. We see a React component. As I explained, React is all about creating components, basically custom HTML elements, you could say, which you can then use to construct your application. This app component actually gets used in the index.js file where we render it into the place of this root element. And we could render a normal HTML element here too, test for example. This would work. This is now no React component. If I save this, I see this h1 tag. But of course, then we have no real React application. We're rendering a normal HTML element, but we're not rendering our own React component. Now you could, of course, use multiple React DOM renders and render all the HTML code you want to use in your app. That's not really how you create your React apps though. Typically, you render one root component, the app component, but you can name it whatever you want. One root component, in our case it is the app component, named app, and in there you would nest all the other components your application might need. And of course, these components can then also be nested into each other. But all the way up to the top, you only have one root component. You could reach out to multiple nodes in your HTML file and mount different root components for different React apps all in the same project. That would be possible. But it's not what we do here. In the end, you can of course simply replicate what you learn in this course for multiple applications in one and the same HTML file. But let's stick to the general or typical usage of React. We have this app component, which is defined in the app.js file. Here we see one of two ways of defining a React component. We create a JavaScript class with the class keyword, and then we use the extends keyword to inherit from this component object, or class to be precise, which is imported up here from the React library. Actually, we import two things: React, which is responsible or required for rendering anything to the DOM. We always need to import that in a file where we define a component. And of course, the component class itself. I will soon show you a different way of creating components though. Now, this class has one method, the render method. It needs to have that because React will call this method to render something to the screen. There's one important job every React component has to do. It has to return or render some HTML code which can be rendered to the DOM, to the screen. You can do other things in there too, reach out to the internet, do some calculations, listen to events. Whatever you need in your application, we will see all of that in that course, but you always also need to render some HTML to the DOM. This is so important to keep in mind. We then export this app class as the default export of this file. This is an ES6 feature and simply means if you import this whole file, you simply import this class because it's the default export. We do use this in the index.js file where we import app from the app file. Again, omitting this extension because it's added by our build workflow automatically for JavaScript files. This app name here, by the way, is chosen arbitrarily, but typically you use the name of the component you also use in the file and you also use as the file name. One side note, you might also see these components with .jsx as a file extension instead of JS. The reason for this is this code here. I referred to it as HTML, which is returned, but in the end, this is not HTML. It looks like it, but it is JSX. So it is JavaScript looking a bit different. And this can be confusing at first when you're learning React. This might be one of the most confusing things actually. Important to know is this is just some syntactical sugar. It was basically invented by the React team, and we can write it in our JavaScript files because of the build workflow we're using here. It will basically automatically transpile it to valid JavaScript in the end. It's not connected to the file extension you're using. It works in .js and .jsx files. And the convention nowadays is pretty much to always use .js files, which is why we do it here too. And it simply is code or a syntax we can use to write HTML in quotation marks, whilst in the end not writing it. Sounds confusing? Let me show you what this actually is compiled to in the next lecture.